an honor to be here. I understand that I am the first conservative speaker to be speaking at Lock Haven in living memory. This, in case you haven't figured out, is not a good thing. Universities are supposed to be about exchange, debate, discussion, facts. I'm going to be speaking about some controversial topics, but I think you'll see I'm going to speak about them in a measured, commonsensical, and heavily factual way. If you want to protest or walk out, you can. But I would urge you to wait until you hear something that is actually hateful. Because sometimes people get whipped up into a frenzy. Oh, there's a hate speaker coming to campus. And the hate never happens. It's purely abstract. It's in, you may say, in the propaganda, but not in anything the speaker says. So I'm actually here to have a discussion and a dialogue. And if you leave, not only will you not hear from me, but I will have a chance to hear from you. So that's not good either. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an immigrant from India. I came to the United States at the age of 17. I still remember walking off the airplane in JFK. I had $500 in my pocket, and I knew that if I stayed in America, that's all I would have to make it in a new country. And yet, as I set foot in America, I had this strange feeling of excitement, of, you may say, moving from the margin of the world to the center. I had this feeling that I was coming to a country in which I could be, in a way that I wouldn't be able to be anywhere else, an architect of my own destiny. I've always wanted to live a life in which I can be in the driver's seat of my own future. And America offered me this kind of promise. In some ways, I would say I've lived the American dream, but I also want you to know I've lived the American nightmare. I stood in a courtroom a few years ago and I heard a bailiff bark out the words, United States of America versus Dinesh D'Souza. I was in a federal case in which dozens of FBI agents were assigned to go through my bank records, my tax returns, read every word I ever wrote, with the goal of locking me up in federal prison for 2 years. So I've seen the best of America. I've also seen the ways in which America sucks. And my patriotism has had to reconcile these two opposites. Now, my topic for this evening is diversity, multiculturalism, and these are topics that are naturally of interest to me, and yet they are topics that are puzzling at the same time. I remember feeling this puzzlement literally weeks after I set foot on the Dartmouth campus. A year after I did high school in America, in Arizona, I was admitted to Dartmouth. I went to school in New Hampshire, and one of the first things I encountered was, you may say, multiculturalism in its very early form. And one of my professors, I remember saying that multiculturalism is the idea that all cultures are basically equal. No culture is better or worse. No culture is superior or inferior. And I thought to myself, this for me is extremely strange, because if all cultures were truly equal, I can't think of why someone would get up and move from one culture to another. In other words, if you think of what the immigrant is doing, I'm not talking about the refugee, I'm talking about the immigrant who voluntarily relinquishes one society and migrates by choice to another. Now, why would the immigrant do that? I mean, we are all naturally attached to our own community. I was attached to my own school, my family, my friends. My whole world was over there. And so I said to myself, doesn't it seem that immigration is a walking refutation of cultural relativism? Because the immigrant is voting with his or her feet in the most decisive way possible against your own culture to which you have a natural affinity. And why would you move to another culture if you did not think that this other culture, on the balance, is going to be better, is going to offer you a better life than you could get over there? So I just want you to get the feeling for how, from a young age, I have had to reconcile these kind of, you may call them nostrums of diversity. I've had to reconcile them with my own experience, Now, the most important kind of diversity in a university is diversity of mind, diversity of ideas. Other forms of diversity are important, by and large, to the degree that they lead to this. So they are subordinate to the intellectual diversity, which is the essence of a university. And what I want to argue is that this intellectual diversity is in very short supply. Not only that, but the invocations of other forms of diversity are mobilized against it. In other words, the invocation of diversity it then generates a whole series of ideas, safe spaces, this is offensive, that upsets me. And so intellectual diversity finds itself being crowded out by people who take offense. They take offense. Now, they take offense to what? To what? We could have a whole theoretical debate tonight about hate speech. If, several years ago when the Nazis marched through Skokie, the ACLU had a difficult decision about whether or not to defend the Nazis' right to free speech. If a Nazi were coming to speak at Lock Haven, you could have a very interesting debate about the margins of the First Amendment and to what, but that is not the debate we're having now. That's not the debate we're having now. The debate we're going to have now is that I'm about to tell you a whole bunch of things that you will find kind of shocking. You shouldn't. You should actually know them. The good news is you don't have to take my word for anything I say. And in the age of the internet, you can check me out on Google in 10 seconds. So if I say anything that is even debatable, you will find out immediately. So I'm going to stay on extremely safe ground and tell you nothing that is even historically debatable. I'm going to tell you stuff that is straight out fact. And I want to assure you that these facts that you're about to hear will shock you to your core. And they will make you feel unsafe. Why? Because your professors have been lying to you. They have been lying to you. They have been suppressing the facts I'm about to tell you. And so the facts I'm about to tell you will therefore make you uncomfortable, which will then get your professors to say that I'm creating an unsafe environment, even though the only unsafety that you're facing is the unsafety of truth itself. Of truth itself. So the question really is, do you have courage? Are you willing to hear me out? I'm willing to hear you out. And let's see who has the truth on their side. Now, you have a bunch of guys going around right as we speak, knocking down Confederate statues in the American South. Because the Confederate statues are a monumental reminder of a horrible legacy of American and Southern racism and slavery and racial oppression and racial terrorism. And then we have, going on at right about the same time, The NFL controversy about taking a knee and a refusal to come out for the national anthem. And again, if you think about it, the rationale is kind of the same. That the American anthem and America, rah-rah America, represents a lot of bad things that America did that seem to have been swept under the rug. So in doing patriotism, aren't we giving tribute to those bad things that we don't want to endorse? Now, this is when the debate gets really interesting, because when we look at those Confederate statues, we have to ask ourselves, was the slavery debate between the North and the South? And my answer to that question is no. The secession debate was in fact between the North and the South. The South seceded, true. But the slavery debate was much older. The slavery debate went way back. The slavery debate to some degree went back to the founding, but it certainly intensified in the decades leading up to the Civil War. Who was the slavery debate between? The reason we know it was not between the North and the South is, first, most Southerners did not own slaves. Most Confederates did not own slaves. But, and here's the really interesting point, the Northern Democrats protected slavery with the same cunning zeal as the Southern Democrats. When Abraham Lincoln identified a troika of bad guys who were defending slavery, two of them, the president, James Buchanan, from this state, was from the North. And the other was Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois. Two of the three, the third was Roger Taney, who wrote the Dred Scott decision. Two of the slavery defenders were Northerners. So right away we see that there's a kind of wrinkle in the ointment of the idea that the slavery debate was North-South. I want to suggest that the slavery debate was in fact a debate between the pro-slavery Democratic Party and the anti-slavery Republican Party. Now, when I say this on campus, inevitably, a professor will stand up and say, Dinesh, you're being very simplistic. You can't make these neat divisions between the parties. Surely you've got to remember there was a great deal of blame to go around. Actually, no. No. In 1860, the year before the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. Let me repeat myself. No Republican owned a slave. All the slaves in the United States, of which there were at the time 4 million, were owned by Democrats. Now, when I first said this a year ago, it created a big sensation, and hundreds of researchers went to hit the books. And if you think about it, I'm making a kind of a scientific statement, right? I'm making a statement that is verifiable, refutable. All you have to do is give me a list of 5 Republicans who own slaves, and I would have to take it back. But to date, I want to assure you that no one has given me a single counterexample. None. One guy, after months of research, goes, you know what, Dinesh, I gotcha. Ulysses S. Grant inherited a slave on his wife's side. And I go, that's true. But when that happened, Ulysses S. Grant was a Democrat. He had not yet moved over to the Republican Party, which he did later. Now, the reason this is important is, let's back up for just a second. Slavery is a very old institution. And the reason that the American founders allowed it in the Constitution, in the Union, is there was no other way to get a union. Lincoln understood this, as did Frederick Douglass. And for Lincoln and Douglass, the founders treated slavery as an evil to be tolerated out of necessity until you could get rid of it. For the Democrats of the 19th century, slavery became a positive good. Not even talking about the Southern Democrats. Let's look at Stephen Douglas, the leader of the Democratic Party who ran against Abraham Lincoln, not just for the Senate, but then for the presidency. Stephen Douglas wanted slavery in America to be forever. He wanted slavery to be permanent. He said, let every state, let every territory decide for itself if it wants slaves. And if his way was successful, that would be the case now. Every state would be deciding now if we wanted to have slavery or not. This was the Democratic Party's official position in the 1860 election. And you might say, well, Dinesh, all right, I get you, but isn't this stuff rather old? Why are we talking about slavery? Well, we have to talk about slavery because they're pulling down Confederate monuments. And the reason they're pulling down Confederate monuments, now you'd like to say that the Democratic Party is having a moment of conscience. The Democratic Party is saying, you know what? We did a lot of terrible things in American history. We actually were the party protecting slavery. And so we can't stand these reminders of slavery, so we got to take these monuments down. That's because we're acknowledging our history. For the first time, we're admitting it. We're apologizing for it. That's not what's going on, is it? What's going on is what I want to call, my new book is called The Big Lie, because there's a big lie going on. And the big lie is, let's take all the blame for what we Democrats did and put it on the South. That's why no one's pulling down Stephen Douglas's monument in Chicago. That's why no one is going through West Virginia and pulling down all the monuments of Robert Byrd, longtime member of the Ku Klux Klan. He's not being targeted. Now, again, let's talk about the national anthem for a minute. America did this, and America did that. Actually, America did nothing. America doesn't do anything. Some Americans do stuff, and other Americans stop them. So let's talk about which Americans did what. And let's begin by going after slavery. So I want to suggest that after slavery, the Democratic Party almost unanimously opposed the 13th Amendment, freeing the slaves. I believe unanimously opposed the 14th Amendment, granting equal rights under the law. And I believe unanimously opposed the 15th Amendment, granting blacks the right to vote. This was the official position of the Democratic Party post-slavery. The Democratic Party is also responsible for every segregation law in the South, without exception. All those laws were passed by Democratic legislatures and signed by Democratic governors. And so, when you hear about the legacy of segregation, once again, there's not a lot of blame to go around. One party did it all, and the other party tried to stop them. The Ku Klux Klan was founded by Nathan Bedford Forrest, with some other guys, a delegate to the Democratic National Convention. Shortly after he started the Klan in the 19th century, the Republicans shut it down. The Ku Klux Klan ceased to exist until 30 years later it was revived by one of the progressive icons of the 20th century, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson screened a pro-KKK movie to his cabinet in the White House, and the Klan saw a massive national revival going way beyond the South. Like there were Klan chapters in Indiana, in Maine, in California. Who did that? Woodrow Wilson did that. Why don't we know that? Because someone has kept you from knowing it. Now, according to the progressive historian Eric Foner of Columbia, now close to retirement, I believe, Foner says in his book on Reconstruction that for 30 years, quote, the Ku Klux Klan was the domestic terrorist arm of the Democratic Party, end quote. If you look at the Klan in the 150 years of its existence, virtually every single Klan leader in states and nationally has been a Democrat. So you can go around shouting the name David Duke all you want, but David Duke is an extreme anomaly. Virtually every Klan leader has been a Democrat. Now, again, you might say, We're still talking about a long time ago. Isn't it true that the Democrats redeemed themselves by doing the civil rights laws of the 60s? No, that's not true. More Republicans proportionally voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Bill of 1968 than Democrats did. If you doubt me, look it up. Look it up. If the Congress had had no Republicans, if you had only Democrats, none of those laws would have passed. The opposition to the civil rights movement did not come from the Republican Party, it came from the Democratic Party, from the racist wing of the Democratic Party, the so-called Dixiecrats. And here we have a progressive counter-move that needs to be noted. The parties switched sides. The Republicans became Democrats, the Democrats became Republicans. Now, frankly, to anyone who has lived through American politics, if anyone says this kind of thing, you can realize on the face of it, it makes no sense. This was like somebody who literally would come to you and say, you know what? At a certain date in the 60s, the cops and the criminals switched sides. The cops all became criminals. The criminals all became cops. Now, on the face of it, you'd be like, really? Certainly the burden of proof is on the guy who says that, to show that that actually occurred. The beauty of this kind of nonsense is that you can test it out, and you can check me out. So, go to your phone and enter the word Dixiecrats, and all their names will come up, a whole roster of them, and then simply ask the following question to Google: how many Dixiecrats, how many racist Dixiecrats became Republicans? And I will help you out by telling you the answer in advance. One guy. One guy. Strom Thurmond. That's it. Every other racist Dixiecrat remained in the Democratic Party and was lionized in the Democratic Party to their deaths. There are Senate buildings named after them. As I mentioned, half of West Virginia is named after Robert Byrd. Robert Byrd Highway, Robert Byrd Medical Center, Robert Byrd this, Robert Byrd that. Notice no Antifa guys are pulling down his statues. Why? Because if you're a Democrat, you get to be in the Klan. Bill Clinton was at Robert Byrd's funeral in 2010, and he basically said, don't be too hard on old Robert Byrd for being in the Klan. You had to be in the Klan in those days to advance in the Democratic Party. End quote. True statement. You had to be in the Klan. Now,